Hello everyone. This will be Wednesday's class. That's going to be April 8th. And I'm actually doing this on Tuesday night, so if you log in later, you might see this and get access to it Tuesday night. But anyways, though, I just want to remind you of a couple of things and go over the schedule for the remainder of the semester here. Remember that Sunday, of course, the annotated bibliography is due, and remember that this assignment counts for 30% of the grade. Okay, so it's a big portion of the final grade. So that means if you look on the syllabus, there are all those categories down there, and it's implied, of course, that you have done all of those things, and it's going to culminate in this annotated bibliography. So remember that the most important thing are the quality of your sources and how well you summarize them. And in terms of length, once again, I don't want to put a minimum or maximum on it, but in general, I would say that you probably want to have about a page or so, maybe a little bit less, for each of the sources. So that means like one half page, maybe even a little bit more for the summary of the article, and then maybe a shorter paragraph on how you would use them hypothetically if you were to write a paper on that topic. Okay, so remember that it's a big portion of the grade, so don't just quickly find Saturday night 5 sources that are that you find on Google or something like that and just put them together and think you're going to get a good grade. You want to make sure to be using scholarly articles that you find from the library. Okay, and Monday's class will be looking at resumes and cover letters, so obviously there's not going to be an assignment with that, not going to be any quiz or no papers on or anything, but it's just for your benefit, and it's a good class to have because I know that, well, obviously the economy right now, everything is pretty much closed, so there's not a lot of companies out there hiring or even doing internships at this point. But nonetheless, though, it's still good information to have. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing Monday next week. And then also next week, we'll be doing one more reading blog assignment from the textbook. And then we will probably have maybe one or two short, grammar exercises for that. And then we'll talk about the week after next week. So I just want to show you some examples here of in the next slide here. In terms of format, okay, make sure to do this in MLA format, but I wanted to show you this because there's one thing that's technically wrong with this, and that is just the second line there should be tabbed over, okay? But other than that, it's fine. I mean, yeah, and technically speaking, the paragraph part where it starts off with Lamott's book, that should, I guess, probably be over to the left. The thing is that MLA doesn't really have a set form, like a format for all this, but I mean, if you do it like this is fine, but you want to have that second line tabbed over so that you have hanging indents there. Also, this one actually comes from UCF. This is from their English department, and this one's good here, with the exception of one thing that I would like you to do. But you see here how they have the author's name, the article title, the journal title, the volume number, the issue number, and the year, and the pages, of course. The only thing that you should do here is that the next part where it starts off with Gilbert provides some insight, you probably want to have that like as a paragraph. So you want to hit the return key and start it on the next line. And then also right here, you see how the paragraph ends at the bottom? I mean, this would be too short for your assignment. And actually, I think that I only took the first top of the reference here. So you obviously want to have your paragraph a little bit longer than this, especially because you're going to be using articles that should be very, very long because they come from academic journals, okay? Okay, so I think we left off with this last time. We were talking about censorship, and again, I'm just trying to give you some ideas if you're still thinking about a topic. I mean, at this point, it's going to be Wednesday. You should already have a topic, and a lot of you, I'm sure, are probably close to done, if not done. But I'm just giving you some ideas here, and remember that a lot of these things can overlap a little bit. So, for example, anything that we talked about last time with ethics, if there was anything in there that you wanted to pursue, well, guess what? You can also tie that in with censorship here that we're going to be talking a little bit more about today. So I just wanted to throw that out there. But in any case, though, this is a pretty interesting presentation. So I hope you stick around because this is one of my favorites is talking about media censorship. So there are four main justifications for censorship. The first one is what's known as the harm principle. This just states that things in the media should be censored to prevent harm to others. So, for example, I think I mentioned last time, but there are shows on television that, like Forensic Files or some of those crime shows, that arguably go a little bit too far in showing the audience how to maybe commit crimes and get away with it, because they show you inside tricks that the police use to catch the criminals and so forth. Well, arguably, maybe some of the content on television should be censored a little bit, not necessarily just taken out completely, but maybe there are certain things that they shouldn't really reveal, because guess what? Criminals could be getting ideas and they might be thinking about things that could ultimately cause harm to other people. And then also, we always have complaints of video games. We're going to save that for the end of this presentation because we're going to go through all the media types and we'll talk a little bit about video games. Okay? The next one is what's known as a paternalism principle, and this just states that content should be controlled to prevent harm to yourself. So a great non-media example of this is seatbelts. You are required by law to wear your seatbelt because if you get into an accident, then and you have your seatbelt on, it's going to prevent harm to yourself. So most people wear seatbelts anyways, regardless. I mean, do it instinctively when you get into a car, but I still know people who don't, but most people do. But the idea is that if you get into an accident, whether it's your fault or not, just by having a seatbelt on, you're going to prevent harm to yourself. Okay, so I tell you what, I'm just going to skip this. It goes into like smoking in the movies and stuff like that. But let's just go to the next one, which is the offense principle. And this just states that things should be censored to prevent offense to others. So the first example that you see there, The Amazing Racist. Now, many of you have probably heard of Ari Shaffir. He's a fairly well-known comic. You know, he's good friends with Joe Rogan and some others. He's actually been in the news recently because he made a joke about the Kobe Bryant passing, or he made like a tweet, I think, and it got a lot of attention. Now, he wasn't serious, but a lot of people still were offended by it. And anyways, though, he had a series of videos back in the day that he called himself the Amazing Racist. In fact, this is kind of what led to his popularity, how he first became well known. I actually interviewed that guy back in the day when I used to write for my college newspaper. And basically the synopsis of these shows, of these little videos, I'm sure you can probably find on YouTube, is that he goes around and he tries to pick on different races and offend them. And, you know, he's not really racist, but he does it in the name of comedy. But still, some people could be offended by that. So that's why he's been very controversial over the years. Also, YouTube, the next example you see there, it says war footage, and that's true because YouTube has been in trouble or gotten into some controversy for showing footage, or people would upload videos showing footage of war. And of course, YouTube and Facebook, for that matter, they can't really control everything that everybody puts on there. But at the same time, sometimes, you know, people will catch those things that they're offended by, and then YouTube will censor them. And it's not just things like war footage, but we're also talking about, people posting homophobic messages or racist messages and things like that. And YouTube and Facebook, they do their best job, but sometimes they can't catch everything. But anyways, that's a justification for censoring, is the offense principle. And then also, Commercials. I'll show you some examples here. Well, actually, I'm not going to show you these examples, but I'll just tell you about them. There was a commercial a few years ago that was from some organization that wanted to bring awareness to the fact that there are still landmines across the world. And we need to take steps to locate them and try to do our best to remove them and so forth. So they did this commercial where it's a little girl's soccer game. And everybody's having a good time, the kids are playing soccer, and then boom, they step on all these landmines and so forth. And you could say that it was an effective commercial because it certainly became popular and it certainly brought awareness to the issue, but still a lot of people were offended by those. There were also, in recent years, there were also some commercials that tried to bring awareness to men's violence against women and domestic abuse and so forth. So there was a series of commercials where they tried to illustrate this. And like one example was where like a waitress spilled coffee on a guy or on his table, and he got all upset and then threw a coffee mug at her and everything. It was very, very violent and very, very graphic. And the point of the commercial is to bring awareness to men's violence against women. And you could say that it's effective in that regard because it, once again, it got a lot of clicks on YouTube and so forth. And I'm sure you could probably find it today on YouTube as well. And but again, a lot of people were offended by it. Okay, so you can see the details here. It was well, you can read these details later. But anyways, the point is that it got censored. Okay, now the next example is, once again, I wish we had a class here because this is one of the reasons why this class is so fun, is because I would ask, like, does anybody know why this was offensive to people? This is a print ad from Starbucks. And then secondly, did Starbucks do this on purpose or was it just coincidence? And so if you can see here, if you want to pause it here, pause the video here, and just take a minute to guess what it is. And but I'll show you. Okay, so the first thing is if you notice the title of the ad, collapse into cool. Okay, that word collapse is key. The second thing is that a lot of people saw those two cups as towers, the twin towers. And then they saw those flies, those dragonflies, and I think the one on the right is a butterfly, or whatever, these insects crashing into the towers. And so a lot of people were kind of offended by this. And once again, it's one of those things you ask, did Starbucks do this intentionally, or did they just do this and didn't have any idea? And it's up for debate. Okay, the next principle is what's known as the moralism principle. And this just states that things in society should be censored to prevent morally offensive content, okay? So some of you may have grown up in what we call dry counties or even semi-dry counties, which means that in those counties, they will not allow the sale of alcohol. So, and sometimes semi-dry counties, they won't sell alcohol after a certain time or on Sundays, for instance, things like that. So it's mainly there to prevent the sale of alcohol at certain days or certain times. And the idea here is that, hey, alcohol is not illegal, but a lot of people think, and this goes back to all the way back to Prohibition, a lot of people think that alcohol is immoral and it leads to immoral behaviors. Okay, the next thing would be that the politicians in New York City back in the 1990s made a conscious effort to clean up the city because you had a lot of people, especially tourists, that would come to New York City and they would see all these homeless people on the streets. They would look and there's all these adult stores on the corners, there's liquor stores everywhere, and it just got this reputation as being a very dirty city. So the politicians, and Rudy Giuliani was mayor at the time, they made a conscious effort to clean up the city, to clean up its image, and they took steps to do that. And I think I think I told you this in class, but there was a case where Michael Eisner, who was the CEO of Disney at the time, he wanted to branch out and bring more Disney productions into Broadway, theatrical productions into Broadway. But the problem is that Disney really couldn't do it for a long period of time because New York was just a very, very dirty city, and of course, Disney has this very clean-cut image, and so they really couldn't do anything until New York City cleaned up the city. So this was good not only for, I guess, cleaning up their city and cleaning up its image, but also for financial purposes, because now you would have Disney bringing in more productions and so forth. Okay, so now let's look at the different types of media that get censored. The first one, of course, are books. And of course, a lot of times books are censored for moral or political reasons. Sometimes it's for religious purposes, parents groups. They a lot of times want to pull certain books out of schools or at least have books censored. So if you look down there at the bottom check mark there, the issue is freedom of access versus freedom of children. We, of course, love freedom of speech, but then sometimes people think it goes maybe a little too far sometimes and that things need to be censored. So some of the common ones that come up here, the Alice series, Harry Potter, Of Mice and Men, Army in America, Culture by Michael Belsiles, and Fallen Angels by Walter Dean Myers there. Now, most of these you probably wouldn't have read in school, except for Of Mice and Men. I think is still commonly used as a book in most schools. But even if you do use a book like that, they will oftentimes censor it and take out words or maybe take out passages or just clean up the language a little bit. So those would be examples of censored books. Also, some other ones here, you can just see here, I won't go through them all, but here you can kind of see these. And of course at the bottom, you know how Caged Bird, Huck Finn, Captain Underpants, those are often censored as well. Okay, now some of you may have heard of the author Chuck Palahniuk. He wrote the book Fight Club, and of course there's a movie Fight Club that was based on it. But anyways though, he had a short story, and let me back up for a second. In the publishing world, a lot of times what will happen is that publishers will send their authors out to do tours, essentially, where they go to certain libraries or they go to certain events and they'll do some readings and they'll sign autographs and things like that. So supposedly, Guts was a story written by Chuck Palahniuk that he claims that when he goes around to tour and read this short story, over 60 people have allegedly fainted while listening to him reading that. Now, there's rumors about this. I don't know if that's actually true. I mean, maybe it was just a publicity thing that he was doing. But anyways, that's the rumor, is that the story is so bad and so graphic that people actually faint when he reads it. And to give you an idea of something else that he wrote that could have been even worse, Playboy magazine published Guts, but they refused to publish one of his other short stories because it was deemed too disturbing. And if Playboy is saying that it's too disturbing and they want to censor it, that could give you an idea of how graphic or disgusting it might be. Okay, now we move on to music. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here as we get into music is that the Parents Music Resource Center, which, by the way, is responsible for the parental advisory stickers that you see on albums, on CDs, and so forth. They are not a government agency. And this is a common misconception that students have. They assume that the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, and other organizations like the MPAA, which puts the RPG, PG-13 on movies, and the ESRB on the video game side, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board on video games, and then the television, you have the Parents Television Council. These are all censoring bodies, but they are not affiliated with the government. Okay, that's a common misconception. The only one that is affiliated with the government, remember I think I mentioned this last time, is the FCC. They control the airwaves. They control broadcast. But all the other censoring agencies out there are not affiliated with the government. Now, when we get to video games, I'll explain one of the reasons behind this. But anyways, though, for now, we'll just look at music. The Parents Music Resource Center, okay? They are not a government agency. They initially were headed by Tipper Gore. Their goal was to make industry help parents identify music with explicit lyrics, and they came out with what we call the Tipper sticker. That's essentially the parental advisory that we have, right? And you can see here, I'm not going to go through all these, but you can look on the screen here. These were the original Filthy 15 songs that they came up with, the reason why they felt that they had to get involved. Now, some of these, if you look today, don't look that bad or wouldn't sound that bad. There's something called ratings creep that we'll get into in a bit. But anyways, these are what's known as the PMRC's Filthy 15. Okay. So it's important to note, though, that stores choose what they sell. So even though today the vast majority of music is sold digitally, you still do have people, not so much in big markets, but you do still have people in smaller markets that still buy CDs, believe it or not. I mean, most of people don't, but still some people do. And it's a lot different than it used to be. In the old days, you had stores like Walmart, especially, but also Target and Best Buy. They accounted for a huge amount of sales. It wasn't always MP3s like we have today. And they still account for something, though. So keep in mind that if you're an artist and you want to sell your CD, well, if you offend a certain group, well, Walmart or Target or Best Buy or companies like that, they have the choice if they want to put their reputation on the line and sell your CD. So keep that in mind. Okay, and of course, just some artists that have historically been blacklisted from radio stations. Eminem back in the day, not so much anymore, but Madonna, if you go through her history, she has a history of being censored. And let's look at some famous album covers that were censored. So you have, this was here in Miami, Florida. You had the Two Live Crew, that was the original. That was the censored version. Okay, the one on the left is the original, the one on the right is the censored. Okay, Guns N' Roses, the one on the left was the original, and the one on the right is what the label changed it to. John Mellencamp here, the one on the left is the original, the one on the right is the censored version that the label ultimately decided on. You see how Jesus in the background there had been taken away. Okay. The Beatles, that was the original, and you see how they have those baby dolls there. And then this is what they made them change to. Okay. Now this one, I told you about this last time, but this one, it's from a rap group called The Coup. And believe it or not, it has nothing to do with 9/11. This was the album cover that they had before 9/11, okay? And the studio or the label was just about to release it when 9/11 happened. So the album ultimately got pushed to a November release that year. But anyways, you can see why this would be offensive to a lot of people, because this was right after 9/11. So the censored version was this. Okay, so obviously much different. Now let's get into film censorship. So you have to understand that early movies were very heavily scrutinized. And even when they came out with movies like Scarface, which is based on Al Capone, a lot of you will probably know the Al Pacino version, which is still a good movie, but it's not as good as the original. And you might not know this, but they're actually coming out with a new version of Scarface, probably next year, from what I've heard, but they're writing it right now. And anyways, though, what they try to do for early movies to avoid being censored is they would try to make the audience feel like a responsible party in this. So they would have these openings in these movies where they would say that this guy is a real bad guy, so it's up to, if you look at the bottom, what are you going to do about it? And of course, the first three big-time gangster movies were Scarface, Little Caesar, and Public Enemy. Those were the big three at the time, but Scarface got the most notoriety. Okay, and so to give you an idea, though, of early film history, and then we'll kind of jump ahead here in a second, though, but in 1934, after a movie like Scarface, the Hays Office was created, and they came up with something that's known as the production code. A guy named Joseph Breen was the guy that really ran it. Even though it was the Hays Office, a guy named Joseph Breen really ran it. And they had these guidelines. And because at the time, people looked at movies and they looked at radio and things like that, and they said, wow, the media has a really strong effect on people, and we better do something about it. So the production code had all of these ridiculous rules. Oops, let me... So things like this. And by today's standards, this seems ridiculous. And of course, today we have ratings anyways. They didn't have those back then. But like things like nudity and suggestive dances were prohibited. Ridicule of religion was forbidden. Couldn't have drug use. You had to be very careful with how you depicted crime. And of course, sex perversion and disease were forbidden, and also childbirth. And to continue, various words and phrases were not allowed, of course, and murder scenes had to be filmed in certain ways. They had even things that, once again, are preposterous by today's standards. But if you showed a married couple in a bedroom together, like going to bed, they had to be in separate beds. I mean, totally preposterous by today's standards, right? But that was the production code, believe it or not. And technically speaking, the code, the office closed in 1945, but there was still this kind of feeling of censorship throughout the industry. And in 1968, that's when we have the MPAA. And I believe the big movie, the reasons for that was a movie called Bonnie and Clyde, which is one of the all-time classics, but it's very, very violent. In fact, if you're a film fan, go on YouTube and just check out the Bonnie and Clyde ending, and you can see how violent that is. And then now we have the development of the MPAA. And if you look here at the next point here, and this is a very, very important case, because up until this time, people said that if you make a movie that's really, really bad, you could be sued here. And what happened is that there was a movie that was released in Italy in 1948, and it was called The Miracle. And it was I forget the plot offhand, but I just know it was heavily controversial. But it premiered, though it was shown in Italy, and it was directed by a guy named Roberto Rossellini. And the thing is, though, that the United States would not show it. They would show the first part of it, but the second part, which was the most controversial part, they would not show. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stated for the first time that films are a significant medium for the communication of ideas. The reason why this is important is because this case set the precedent for a lot of future cases of controversy, meaning that when Natural Born Killers was released and in the 90s, and Oliver Stone was sued and so forth, and they thought that, oh, well, he should be prosecuted and everything and things like this. He used this case as precedent. He said that, hey, the Supreme Court ruled that that films should be protected by the First Amendment. So very significant case. And just some controversial examples from the past. We have 1939, Gone with the Wind. Once again, ridiculous, because at the end, he says, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And damn was considered an offensive word for whatever reason. Again, ridiculous by today's standards. And Disney here, Song of the South, racially offensive themes and caricatures. Last Temptation of Christ. This was picketed and boycotted for its portrayal of Jesus. Hostel was banned in certain countries. And then recently, China, which we've talked about before, and we'll probably talk about again when we get to globalism, but Deadpool was censored in China, Sausage Party was censored in China, Christopher Robin, and then North Korea, The Interview from Seth Rogen a few years ago that was banned. And by the way, keep in mind that I'm only giving you like a drop in the ocean of film censorship here, or all censorship here. We could do a whole class. We could have a whole 4-month semester just on film censorship, or music censorship, or television censorship. But this is just kind of a quick little glance here. And then you even have billboards that have been censored, right? And then I'll just give you some ideas of other ways that film's been censored. And it's a lot of times it's not the MPAA that wants censorship. Sometimes it's the studio itself. So the first 3 movies you see there, the first 3 bullet points, were all made by Orson Welles, one of the great directors of all time. And he made Citizen Kane, which is still considered by many to be the best movie of all time. But the thing about Citizen Kane is that he had complete control, basically from start to finish. I mean, there were things that he didn't want to put in there about William Randolph Hearst, which the film is based on. But for the most part, though, he had complete control. He was able to write, direct, and produce it, and the studio could not get in the way. That was actually in his contract. Unfortunately, though, that didn't happen in his future. And the next year, he made Magnificent Ambersons, and it starts off great, but what happened is the studio butchered it. They cut off about 20 or 30 minutes of what he wanted. Then and the same thing happened with Touch of Evil here. You see the third one, and also Lady of Shanghai, the second one. The thing about Touch of Evil, just a funny little quick anecdote, just a quick little story about this. He made the film exactly how he wanted it. And it's still, even to this day, it's still a great movie. However, he went on vacation after it was done. It was in the can, they told him. He went on vacation to Hawaii. He came back and saw it. And he almost fainted because he could not believe what the studio did to it. This is before it got released, but he saw like the final cut that they were going to release. And it got so bad that he actually wrote a 58-page memo to the bosses, the studio bosses, begging for them to restore his original version. But unfortunately, they didn't. The Wild Bunch was cut by the studio, even though even today that's still a great movie. And then the worst one, though, and then you see at the bottom Brazil, though. The worst one, though, was a movie called Once Upon a Time in America, which was by the great Sergio Leone. And this is still one of the best gangster movies of all time. But when I say the studio cut this, I'm not just talking about even 10 or 20 minutes. They cut about 2 hours. This is like a 4-hour movie. The studio cut 2 hours out of that. It's to the point where it's unintelligible. Like, you literally cannot tell what's going on because characters pop up and you don't know their motives. You don't know anything about them. And luckily today, though, you can get the full version. And just a couple other things here. There's something that we call ratings creep. So I told you that this happens in music. This happens in all media, in film and television, in video games. But basically what this means is that what used to be considered like really, really raunchy and vulgar and extreme content in the old days, today we're so I was going to say desensitized by it, but we're so used to it these days that it seems ridiculous now. That, like, when you say Gone with the Wind, where he says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." Like, are you kidding me? That was controversial, saying the word damn. And that's all that this ratings creep means. So those Filthy 15 songs from the PMRC, a lot of those songs would be benign by today's standards, right? And I'll just tell you, though, that like a couple examples of this, if you've ever seen the movie Gremlins, which was not directed by Spielberg, but produced by Spielberg, they turned that into a PG-13 movie, and I believe that was where the first time they ever used PG-13. They said, well, it's too bad for young kids, or it's too extreme for young kids, but it seems not that bad for adults. So what's kind of the middle ground for that? So they came up with PG-13. And then Basic Instinct. When you see that today, and these are just a couple examples, but when you see Basic Instinct today, initially that was an NC-17 movie. And I think that the director Paul Verhoeven, he had to remove like a couple of things here. But even if you see the original version that he wanted today, it seems ridiculous that that would be NC-17. And the same thing happens with another movie around this time called Showgirls, which was a really, really bad movie. But it was actually was rated NC-17, not R. And when you see it today, though, it's like it doesn't seem that bad at all. And oh, but let me go back for a second here. Well, technically, if you want to look into the history of this is the first film that got the NC-17, Henry and June. But let me go to the next one here because this, I'll tell you the story about this, and then we'll go on to video games next. But in terms of film, okay, back about a decade ago, there were these two companies, Clear Play and Clean Flicks, and they were both based in Utah, a heavily Mormon population. And here's what they were doing. Okay, Clear Play would take R-rated movies and they would remove the extreme content from those movies and then repackage them and sell them to. And here's the thing though, this was not about money. Because what they would do is that they weren't just censoring the movie. What they would do is that they would buy 2 copies of the movie. So in the end, the directors were making twice as much money. But the Directors Guild of America was so pissed off with doing this. They said, hey, if you're going to show my movie, I want it to be shown exactly how I made it. I don't want you to censor it in any case. And this case went to the Supreme Court. Another company called Clean Flicks was slightly different though. What they did is they had a special machine or a software that they would allow you to put a movie into. In other words, think of it like a DVD player, like a special DVD player. And what it would do is that the DVD player would have special, I guess, alarms throughout, and it would skip past the content that was deemed to be too extreme. Now, what the Supreme Court said at this time was that Clear Play, sorry, you can't do that. Okay, you can't take somebody's work. This is protected by the First Amendment. You can't take somebody's work and just butcher it up. Clean Flicks is a little bit different because they weren't actually altering the movie itself. They just had a machine that was able to do it. So the Supreme Court said that that would be okay. Okay. Now, when you think about it, though, it doesn't really make sense that Directors Guild would even care so much because, first of all, they're getting money. And secondly, when you think about it on television, they show movies on television all the time with commercial breaks and they censor the content and so forth. But anyways, though, a couple of controversial cases that came up about a decade ago. And of course, you always have director's cuts too, where directors are upset with a lot of the changes that the studio makes. I just told you about Orson Welles. And if Orson Welles had his way, if he was alive today, he could have made that movie and had his director's cut be out probably. But it just goes to show you, though, that directors are very, very serious with their work and they don't want their work to be censored or touched by anybody. Okay, now we move on to video games. And now here's the thing, because I told you about how none of these organizations, the ESRB is video games, but I told you that the FCC is the only one that's associated with the government. The PMRC, the MPAA, the Parents Television Council, which we'll talk about next after video games, but all of those are not associated with the government. But people wonder, okay, why? Why doesn't the government have a role? Well, here's the thing. Back in the early 90s, the video game industry was coming out with games that were really, really violent, and the government essentially told the video game industry, hey, you better come up with a ratings board or we're going to do it for you, okay? And that's what started the ESRB. And they're just an independent organization that regulates video games. So they're the ones that put the MA for mature on the video games. Okay, and I think that technically, again, it might vary by state, but I think that technically speaking, legally speaking, I don't think that kids of a certain age are allowed to buy certain games if they have a rating on them, like an MA rating on it. But who knows? They'll probably get them anyways, I'm sure. Okay, so Grand Theft Auto is the big one though, and we ask, have they crossed the line? Now, most people would say no. I mean, it's just a game and everything. However, I will tell you though, there was a case where a kid named Devin Moore, he went out, and I think this is famous case back in the 2000s, but he actually shot a couple of people and a couple police officers, I think. And when they asked him why he did it, he tried to blame Grand Theft Auto specifically. He said, "Well, I saw it in Grand Theft Auto." Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the courts didn't side with him necessarily, but you still have this ethical issue, this ethical debate about, do video games have a responsibility? Should they be more responsible? Or is it the parents that have to be monitoring their kids a little bit more? Once again, this is one of these classes that I wish we would have class discussion on this, because we always have some great opinions on both sides of the issues. So, anyways, though. So, now here's the thing. I actually took out the images of these because I'm practicing the harm principle or the offense principle. I don't want to offend others that are watching this, right? But anyways, though, people often say, if we go back here, people often say that Grand Theft Auto, well, that's okay. I mean, that's, people can buy that on PlayStation. But in today's age, though, people have the ability to make their own games and distribute them through the internet. So a couple examples of these that were very, very controversial were Ethnic Cleansing and Special Force. These were kind of like, if you want to call them like neo-Nazi games. And I'll just tell you, like in Ethnic Cleansing, you can read the rules here. Neo-Nazi signs appear, National Alliance signs appear throughout the game, and the player chooses either a KKK or a skinhead character. And your object is to roam the streets, murdering various races and their Jewish masters, thereby saving the white world. Various slurs are heard throughout, and when you confront the end boss, it's a rocket launching, wielding Ariel Sharon, right? And so people say that, oh, well, video games don't cross the line, but then when people see games like this, maybe they do, right? Also, there was another one of these games called Super Column Massacre, and if you remember the Columbine case, or not the Columbine case, a different case actually, not the Columbine case, they blamed Marilyn Manson actually, to go back to music. And there's a great interview, well, actually there's several great interviews with Marilyn Manson, by the way, where people in the media held him responsible for that, for Columbine, because the kids that did that school shooting, they were huge fans of Marilyn Manson, and he has a great argument though against why that's not true. And of course, he didn't condone those at all. I mean, Marilyn Manson, he does it for his image. He's just trying to make money. He's not really as bad as a lot of people make him out to be, or how his reputation is. So you can go on YouTube and you can probably find a lot of interviews with Marilyn Manson. Now, let me go back for a second here though. This one, yeah, this one was called Super Columbine Massacre. It was based on Columbine, released in 2005, and this possibly influenced a Canadian school shooting because that kid ended up being a huge fan of this game. So once again, it's like, how much responsibility do video games have? And then you have another game like JFK, oh, I'm sorry, 9/11 Survivor, okay? This is one where you can kind of go through the scenarios here, but you start in the towers. You can escape if you start on the lower level, and you can kind of see here, you can kind of go through. At the end here, you have to choose between being engulfed by flames or jumping from the window if you are unlucky to get into a high spot. And so you can kind of see here, and there are images on there, I'm not going to put them up there, but you can kind of see here another example of a game that probably goes too far and was censored. And then there are, did I get to it yet? Sorry for going back to these slides too often. I thought I had this one up, but maybe I don't. There was another game called JFK Reloaded. Okay, there we go. Where, once again, I'm not going to show you the images though. The thing about this game is that they tried to recreate the Oswald shooting. Now, it wasn't technically a game if you ask the creators, but everybody kind of played it as if it were a game. Their goal in doing it was to try to prove that Oswald couldn't possibly act it alone. So the goal of the game is to see if you could pull off as many shots as Oswald supposedly shot, and pretty much you could not do it. And that was the creator's goal. Whether they were intending to make it that way or if they were just trying to create publicity for it. But anyways, though, that game no longer exists. Okay, and then finally, we talk about how video games can be negative, but arguably there are times when they are used positively, like in maybe helping our military get information and training and things like that. And you see it there up at the top. There's something called Avergaming, where you could go to websites and play games on people's websites or companies' websites. And sometimes these can be very good. McDonald's was very good back in the day of having all these advert games that people would go on and play, and it brings good publicity to them, right? Okay, and then also video games are used in education a lot of times. They have been used for doctors and surgeons and giving people training, especially younger people that are just getting into the field. So these are all examples of how video games can be used in a positive way. Okay, now we get to television. So there was something called the V chip, which stood for a violence chip. Not really popular in today's age, but it was popular in the 1990s to restrict programming for kids. But we have examples of censorship in television, right? So you had the Ed Sullivan Show, a couple of famous incidents where Elvis, when he was on the show, was not allowed to be shown above the waist, because he shook his hips. Jim Morrison from The Doors was not allowed to sing the original lyrics for Light My Fire, but then he agrees and then does it anyways to kind of piss off the censors. And then the Rolling Stones, their famous lyrics, Let's Spend the Night Together, they were forced to change it to Let's Spend Some Time Together. And then, now here's the thing, the Parents Television Council is, once again, not a government organization, but they will allow you through their website to submit complaints to the FCC, which is a government regulation organization, right? So if you wanted to do that, you can just go to parentstv.org, and they come out with a lot of articles, and they're always the first to complain when they see something bad on TV, like the Janet Jackson. And if you want to make a complaint, like a lot of people did about the Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident, then you would go through the Parents Television Council, their website, and then you can make a complaint. They have a complaint right on their website, or a form right on their website for you. And then we talked about this last time, but the reason why cable television gets away with a lot compared to the public airwaves, which are the main three networks, is because the FCC controls the main networks, but they don't control television. And then also you have other shows that are, of course, shot in two different ways. Not so much anymore these days, but back in the day, a lot of television shows that were shown on cable, like these examples, The Sopranos and Sex and the City, were on HBO. And what they did for some of these scenes is that they would show, or they would shoot, two different versions of scenes. And then, yeah, there's National Lampoon came out with a few different DVDs called Lost Reality Series. And what I was telling you earlier about Ari Shaffir and the Amazing Racist, his videos are featured on them. To be honest, a DVD like this, you can probably buy it on Amazon now for a couple dollars. But anyways, though, there were supposedly reality shows that they shot for television pilots and sent to the networks. In reality, they weren't. It was just a way to sell DVDs, and they had no chance of ever getting on a network. But now, if we were in class, I would show you this this video here. It's called Television's Most Censored Moments, where it goes into a lot of these things. But we're not in class, so we'll skip that. And then the thing is about the internet now, and we're about done here, but the thing about the internet is that it's, of course, not regulated by the government, and it's really difficult. I mean, how can you go out there and police every single site that's out there, right? And of course, and to use an example of not really censorship in terms of the principles that we talked about, the offense principle, the moralism principle, paternalism principle, and so forth. But one thing I'll just tell you, though, about copyright. Now, the thing is that the vast majority of websites out there that you go on violate copyright, and they don't even know that they're doing it. Anytime that you show an image or a video or something like that, it's subject to copyright violation. In other words, the person who shot that video or the person who shot that photo or whatever could technically sue you. The reason why they don't or why they can't is because it's difficult for them to track everybody, and they really don't care. A lot of times people want their videos out there. They want their images out there. The exception to this is something that's called the fair use rule, where if you're in education, like if you're in class or something like that, like what we're doing now, I can show you anything from YouTube or whatever because it's protected under the education part of the fair use rule. So, but one of the things that's kind of interesting about the internet, though, is that perceptions change over time. And not just the internet, but censorship in general. Perceptions change over time. What should be censored, what should not be censored. And the Supreme Court that I'd mentioned before ruled that profanity is protected, indecency is protected, but those things have to be under the safe harbor hours, remember? Which are, well, actually, for something to be I guess subject to being fined, they have to be outside of those safe harbor hours, which are 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And obscenity, of course, is not protected by free speech. So indecency and profanity are, as long as they're in that safe harbor hours period, but obscenity is never protected. But perceptions definitely change over time. A very famous quote about obscenity from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart one time is that they asked him, well, how do you define what is obscene? And he says that, well, I can't really tell you, but I know it when I see it, which tells you that this whole issue of censorship that we've been talking about the last couple of classes really is subjective. One person thinks is obscene, maybe another person doesn't. So that's why a lot of these issues and a lot of these cases that we've been talking about oftentimes go to the courts and they decide. And as Justice Potter Stewart says, well, I don't know what obscenity is, I can't define it, but I guess I just know it when I see it, right? Okay, and I guess we're done. No, don't. That was for another class, okay? So anyways, though, we wrapped up here, and looks like we're done a little bit early, which is fine. So once again, to review, go and complete that final essay, or the final project, I should say, the annotated bibliography for Sunday, and we will meet again Monday. We'll go over resumes and cover letters, and then we'll have another reading blog assignment next week I'll tell you about, and we'll have probably a couple other grammar activities. And then when we come back after that, or maybe even starting next Wednesday, we'll start looking at a famous author named Robert Cialdini, who is a very, very popular guy in the psychology field, but also in advertising. Because even though he's a psychologist, a lot of the things he talks about apply to advertising. So I'll just tell you on the final exam period, because we won't have too much more reading after that from the textbook. We might have something, but I'll just tell you that Robert Cialdini will be covered on that final exam period too. So, and I think you'll really love Cialdini. He's probably, I said at the beginning that censorship is one of the more popular classes that I cover, and also media literacy is as well. But Robert Cialdini is as well. I'm just an amazing author. So we'll talk more about that starting next week. Okay, so other than that, have a good week. Finish that assignment, and then let me know if you have any other questions as we go along. Okay?